Video games have come a long way from the early days of titles such as Pong. Now perhaps somebody should have told that to Devil's Thumb Entertainment, because somehow they managed to have GT Interactive publish this absolute disaster of a baseball title released in 1998. Devil's Thumb Entertainment is perhaps not a name that you've come across before. After all, they are only directly responsible for 2 titles, and this was their sole effort on the Nintendo 64. What may surprise you, however, is that this studio is a spin-off of DMA Design. Perhaps the only reason I can think of for this split is that they took all of the terrible staff they had on their payroll, sent them into a tiny room, and told them to make any game they wanted rather than being hit with giving them redundancy payoffs. Piazzas Strike Zone doesn't exist really for any reason. It's a downright terrible baseball title and one which only complete system collectors should ever own. Sure, it features the full Major League licenses for real players, teams and stadia, but that's the only thing giving this game any form of credibility. I'd love to know just how much they had to pay Piazza for his endorsement, because no matter how much cash on this earth could have persuaded many professional athletes to endorse such a terrible game. Essentially, Piazzas Strike Zone is a classic 64-bit sports title which was poorly made. Graphically, it's terrible looking. The players are lifeless, stiff, robotic characters who look like rigor mortis is set in years ago as they lankily move across the field. The players are not the worst looking part of the game, however. The stadia are awful. The crowds look like cheap confetti from a 1980s drive-through wedding chapel, and huge sections of the stadia pop up and pop back out again of view almost on a random basis. The audio too is really pretty bad, but you could have been forgiven for expecting more because the game's intro is actually quite nicely done, but as soon as that ends then things take a nasty turn for the worse. The music for the menus is generic and instantly forgettable, so bad in fact that you'll want to turn down the volume straight away, and there's no need to turn it back up again when you get in the game because it's equally as bad. There's limited lines of dialogue such as when home runs are hit, but they are delivered with about as much enthusiasm as someone who is only being paid to deliver the 3 or 4 lines of dialogue in the entire game. Every hit your batter will make sounds pretty much identical to the last, from a small bunt to a massive home run blasted out of the park. Throw in some horribly muffled crowd effects which sound more like blown out speakers, and you can pretty much know that there's very little redeeming qualities of this title. Of course, the graphics and sound could be overlooked had the gameplay been naturally quite decent. No surprises then that this is not a great playing game. The pitchers spray random pitches with seemingly no intelligence to the overall landscape of the game, and choosing to control the pitching is just dull. The same too comes to play when batting, because it's boring and lacks any technical detail that games like All-Star Baseball had in them. You'll also hit an insane amount of out-of-bounds shots, and if you have one of the better known professional players, then you'll, at the opposite end of the scale, be smashing an unrealistic amount of hits out of the park as they are incredibly overpowered. You can choose to play the game in both simulation and arcade modes with very little to distinguish between both game types, and the menus all have the standard modes that you'd expect, such as exhibitions, World Series, full seasons and home run derbies. The only nice addition was being able to play out a draft in the season mode, but after less than an hour of playing this title, you will quickly realise that you should have never picked it up. And so for today's topic of conversation, I'd love to know what your least favourite developer on the Nintendo 64 was. Sure, Titus will spring to mind for many, but there are many other worthy candidates, and I'm sure you're going to come up with some which even I had forgotten. I'd also love to know what you think the worst endorsed game was on the Nintendo 64 or any other platform for that matter. So sound off in the comment section down below, and until next time.